He just got here. So
Welcome, Carl.
hello, hello, VP
Good
Greenidge.
evening, gentlemen.
Good evening to you.
Good evening.
How are
Uh,
you, Carl? Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I trust that you're
Hi,
finding all
Carl.
in good shape. Thank you.
Yes, so
Hi,
far
Carl.
everyone's in decent shape, and I think I'll give us a little music to cue us up, and then we'll get going.
Okay.
All right. And I still have to. You'll have to re-upload the slides because
Okay. No problem.
you got it.
The Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium presents Transforming Guyana. In each episode, Dr. Blackman and Dr. Lewis will tackle a different area of interest for transforming Guyana.
And good evening, colleagues, and welcome to this special episode of the Guyana Business Journal and Caribbean Policy Consortium webinar series, Transforming Guyana. I'm Terrence Blackman, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York, and founder of the Guyana Business Journal. And as usual, I'm joined by Dr. David Lewis of the Caribbean Policy Consortium and Manchester Trade. Today, in light of current events, the Venezuelan referendum that purports to annex and incorporate into its own territory Guyana's entire Essequibo region, we revisit our Wednesday, September 14, 2022, on Guyana's emergence as a petrostate and the implications for the Venezuela Essequibo controversy. Today's conversation will be led, as it was then, by Mr. Carl Greenidge, former Minister of Finance, Planning and Trade of Guyana, former second Vice President and Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Secretary of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. Professor Ivelaw Griffith, the former 10th Chancellor, Vice Chancellor, and Principal of the University of Guyana from June 2016 through 19. Professor Anthony Bryan, Senior Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and founder and fellow of the Caribbean Policy Consortium, and Dr. Riyad Insanally, Guyana's 8th Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary to the United States of America, and the 4th Permanent Representative to the Organization of American States. Gentlemen, I want to welcome you, wise men all, to the program this evening. And this evening, we will embark on a journey of, broadly speaking, exploration. We will try to unravel the complexities surrounding Guyana's transformation into a petrostate and the intertwined issue of the Venezuela Essequibo controversy. Our goal is to gain a comprehensive understanding of this intricate matter and its implications for Guyana, the region, and beyond. Let me take this opportunity to welcome my co-host, Dr. David Lewis, to say a few words on behalf of the Caribbean Policy Consortium. David?
Thank you, Terrence. Good evening to everybody. Tony Bryan, Riyad Insanally, Ivelaw Griffith, and of course our main keynote, Carl Greenidge. Just a quick reminder, all three of our experts, Tony, Riyad, and Ivelaw, actually CPC fellows. So we're very pleased to have them join us again. Ivelaw is actually also a founding fellow co-chair with us. So we're very pleased that CPC has been getting some traction in a variety of areas of work, not only related to Guyana, but broadly speaking, the Caribbean. And on the issue of the Venezuela-Guyana Essequibo controversy, I'd just like to throw out a couple of issues that have been of concern on our end, sitting here in a business perch in Washington, working particularly the energy sector market, both from the US and the regional perspective, and then leave off to the experts. I'm not a Guyana, Venezuela expert, but I've had my dabbling in both markets. But from our perspective here, one of the things, and I'd be interested to hearing from the team, is what we've sort of seen as the need for more advocacy on Guyana's behalf here in the US market, but also in the rest of the Americas. Something which I have found personally, and that may be the weakness, that it's been weak to date. I think there's a lot more that could be done. I understand the limitations from the part of the Guyana government, small country, foreign service is small and stretched out. But as everybody has been pointing out, this is now becoming an existential issue for Guyana, and I think that's important. Specifically, I've found it curious that the fact that the government of Guyana has retained lobbyists and advisory services in the U.S. over the past 4 years. I believe they're on their third or fourth company right now, many of them big power hitters in the Washington space. We have seen no action from them on this matter. And just as a caveat, I think 2 years ago, this might have been one of those issues that you're working quietly behind the scenes, as Ambassador Insanally would have done so successfully in his tenure here. Now this is all out and open. There's nothing secret or behind the scenes that you have to do. This is now get in your face to people and advise, this is what we need from you, and no ifs, ands, or buts. And we don't see that happening yet. And my third point is, I think it's also a result of, for better or for worse, and despite decades of experience, I found not just in the region, but unfortunately also here in the United States, a very weak understanding of what Venezuelan Chavismo, Madurismo, and Leninismo has become. And I'm always very careful because it's not Marxist-Leninism. None of them are smart enough to understand the Marxist part. It's the Leninist part, which is just power grabbing for the sake of power. We've seen it in Nicaragua. We've seen it in Cuba since, I would say, 10 years after the revolution. And certainly that's what we see in Venezuela. And this is one of those cases where, in the baseball analogy, you don't get 3 strikes before you're out. And in the cricket analogy, you're not going to get full overs either. It's like once you're out once, that's it. And I think it's unfortunate because despite a lot of the policy and legal initiatives, at the end of the day, this is going to fall on the burden of some actions. And we've seen some comments of people who have had bad experiences with Venezuela that, yes, indeed, at some point, they will take an action regardless of everything else. And that's dangerous. And frankly, at the end of the day, I'd rather be sorry than sad. That's one of those situations where people say, well, David, I think you're exaggerating. Well, you know what? Guess what? Let's exaggerate and let's err on the side of exaggeration. But at least that way we know we went all out, because after the fact, there is very little that can be done. And I just go back to the experience at the OAS with Nicaragua. Ambassador Insanally was there. We did a lot of work, and everybody said, oh, no, there's no way they're going to do that. Well, they did that and way more. And in Venezuela, I think that's where we're going. There's no way there's going to be free and fair elections. The opposition is not going to be able to do the things they want to do. And we just keep on playing along just because we think it's the best way to attack it. And then, of course, there's a lot of money interest behind the scene because of the oil and the gas and now the flexibilization of sanctions. So I'm just going to leave it there, and then looking forward to getting the update from our team, particularly as the dates come around with the referendum, the discussions at the ICJ, and so on, and then what will be some of the next steps forward. Again, thank you all again on short notice for allowing us to get you on board. And I think this one is very timely. And, you know, we may be having a new one early in the new year, if not before. So thank you again. Terrence, back to you.
Thank you, David. So first we'll hear from former VP Greenidge, who will give us some sense of an overview of where Guyana stands today in the kind of legal sense, and some of the implications of the Venezuelan referendum. One hopes that we'll have some valuable kind of historical context, and some of the issues as they relate to the international responses through bodies like the United Nations and the International Court of Justice. I always have difficulty saying Carl, so I will say Foreign Minister Greenidge, the floor is yours.
Terrence, we need to let Riyad back in.
Yeah. Well, I was going to take us all out and just.
Okay.
Yeah.
May I start now, Terrence?
Yes, you. Yes.
Thank you for the introduction. You are probably the only one of a very few set of friends who has difficulty using the term Carl. I think most of them prefer to use that rather than any other assignation. Anyhow, good evening, everyone, and I'm going to attempt to give you, in the limited time available to me, an insight into a little bit of the history. It is long and it is not continuous. It has different flows, and therefore even those people that are familiar with the history sometimes are unable to find or understand how we got to 2023 after a number of other things, including 1899. And then I will say something about the agreements around which borders are defined, including Guyana's, and then talk a little bit about the ICJ. I suspect we're not going to be able to do too much of that. And then there are some suggestions as regards references. So the very first slide attempts to show you the context. That is, you have Guyana in that northeast shoulder of South America, with Venezuela to the left and Suriname to the right, the Atlantic and our Caribbean neighbors to the northeast or straight north, and also to the northwest. That's just briefly. Are you able to see the slides at the moment? That slide? The other slide, the next slide, slide 4, shows the actual boundary that was agreed by Venezuela and Britain in 1899, coming out of the arbitration award, the so-called Paris Arbitration Award. And I am hoping that you can discern, running to the west of the map, an area that is unshaded, and that reflects the fact that if you look at the darker line that runs north-south, and you will see something of the title British Guyana, from the T of British and the A of Guyana, Essequibo runs to the west of that, to the left, if you like. As you look at the map, to the left, you have the Essequibo. And I'm pointing this out to you to make this point, first of all, that Essequibo constitutes something like 74% of Guyana's land mass. 74% of Guyana's land mass. And if we had good enough um, uh, facilities to read the place names, you will see that Essequibo, like the rest of Guyana, including Demerara, which is its immediate neighbor to the right, and Berbice, are exclusively of non-Spanish names, exclusively. And this is not because places have been renamed. This is because the settlement of these areas from the very beginning was undertaken by the Dutch. And so you have indigenous Indian names, and superimposed on those indigenous Indian names are, first of all, Dutch names of all types, the same names that you will find in the Netherlands, and you will find names that are English, but outside of those, you will not find any Spanish names. And I draw your attention in the Essequibo, especially along the Essequibo coast, to the place names, which are essentially English names, Amerindian names, or indigenous Indian names, and even French names. So the French presence in Guyana was a matter of minutes in time. If you convert the modern history of this area into 24 hours. And you can still therefore see French names such as La Belle Alliance, where the rebellion against the slavery in 1831 took place. There was no evidence of any Spaniards there, no evidence of Venezuela itself, which had not too long broken off from Gran Colombia. And similar patterns may be found in the names of persons, Mazdama, and all sorts of names that are essentially Dutch names. So a quick scan of the physical, whether it is the location or the maps, give you the impression that that this is essentially a place without a Spanish presence. The nearest name to a Spanish name is probably Punta Playa, and that is a point in the border shared by the two countries. But all the others, Caranabo, Madia, and the others are names that are either English or Dutch. Madia, for example, Lethem, and so forth. Now, so you see that if you look at map slide 5, slide 5 tries to give you an idea of the place names, and it also shows that the significant proportion of the country to the left is what constitutes Essequibo. Very quickly, Guyana's claim to the borders it currently has is based upon a variety of treaties and agreements. And we tend in the debate to talk only of the 1899 arbitral award. But the 1899 arbitral award was intended and did actually look at the contentions of the various parties, Venezuela and Guyana. And you have to bear in mind that Brazil also had claims on this territory. As a result of the examination by the 1899 Paris arbitration panel, Guyana's boundaries were formally defined and enshrined in an agreement. But I wanted to say that the history behind this had to do with how the Dutch came to occupy the territory, how the territory controlled by the Dutch was lost, had been lost by Spain under the Treaty of Munster of the 30th of January 1648. It is also the result of colonization by the Dutch, which took place after 1648. And the consequence of wars, the three colonies were all and always moving together under a single colonial power that did not include Spain, and it certainly had nothing to do with Venezuela. In 1814, the British, as a result of the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars, were able to obtain the three colonies, Essequibo, Demerara, and Berbice. And the treaty, in a treaty of 1802, the countries had, these European countries had recognized that Britain, which had, together with France, been rolling over their control of this territory during the late 1890s, had now control of Essequibo as well as Berbice and Demerara. Treaty of Washington preceded the 1899 arbitration panel. That is as clear and as brief a history as I can give to you on this matter. But what I want to add is that in addition to the 1899 arbitral award, the two countries, that is Britain together with Venezuela, approved the boundaries on the ground. So a boundary commission set out, and in 1905, January the 10th, they agreed on the lines, the demarcation of those boundaries. In 1928, Guyana and Britain and Guyana and Britain, together with Brazil, agreed on a boundary, and there was later in 1928 an agreement on a tri-junction boundary, a point at which Guyana, Brazil, and Venezuela met. And I'm making this point to just draw to your attention that these boundaries not only were based upon multiple agreements, but they had also involved third parties, and therefore attempts to bully one party into unilaterally seceding, or unilaterally bullying a party into ceding territory is not as simple or as straightforward as that. Now, I'd like to turn quickly to the question of the Geneva Agreement, because any commentary you see by Venezuela on the boundary issue uses the Geneva Agreement as a basis for the things that Venezuela is proposing. In 1966, the government of Guyana, Great Britain, and Venezuela, not in that order, in fact, in the reverse order, agreed at the United Nations Committee, that is in November 1962, to examine documentary material relevant to the 1899 award. And in this November of 1963, they reported that a team of experts would examine the documentation with a view to essentially to assuaging the concerns that Venezuela had expressed in '62 concerning the borders and the circumstances leading to the award by the Paris arbitral panel. And I would just like to quote you an observation made by the British ambassador at the time, and this is his statement. In making this offer to examine the documents that Britain had, I must make it very clear that it is in no sense an offer to engage in substantive talks about the revision of the frontier. That we cannot do, for we consider that there is no justification for it. And you will see that passage quoted in the ICJ summary of its own deliberations when we looked at the question of jurisdiction. So this was an effort to prevent Venezuela from blocking Guyana's independence or from seeking to use military action against Guyana, once Guyana became independent. And the UK government at the time, you will recall, when Guatemala was faced by the same threat from a bigger non-English speaking neighbor, when Belize was faced by the threat from a larger non-English speaking neighbor, namely Guatemala, the British provided them with the services of some Harrier jump jets. So Kestrels, they used to call them when I was small. They are now Lightning aircraft. These are some fourth or fifth generation aircraft that are used by the UK and the United States. But Guyana did not have that facility. So this is just to give you an idea as to why this agreement was felt to be necessary. It was the threat from a neighbor. And so that was the Geneva Agreement. The Geneva Agreement itself also explained the reason for the dispute. The reason for its for the passage of the Geneva Agreement in 1966. It explained that it was a controversy as opposed to a dispute. It explained the role of the Secretary General in choosing means of trying to assuage the concerns of either party. And it set out a role for the SG, which role related to the UN Charter, Article 33, in which the United Nations had agreed on several means of resolving disputes or disagreements peacefully. And in that regard, the judicial measures were mentioned, namely, in effect, the ICJ, because this is the highest of the judicial fora at the international level. The Geneva Agreement also provided for a mixed commission, and that mixed commission had a 4-year life. It would run from 1966 to 1970. It provided for representatives on both parties to be on that mixed commission and to examine the documents as I'd mentioned earlier. The means of resolving the controversy were, as I say, listed in Article 33. But the important thing about that is the role of the Secretary General was to identify from those means the next modality for the two parties to resolve their differences in the event that the mixed commission, which was the start of the process, in the event that the mixed commission could not do so. The mixed commission ended in 1966 without agreement, but can I say that insofar as it was without agreement, it was also without agreement that there was any evidence showing that there had been any fraud or impropriety in arriving at the boundaries. The two sides, after 1970, were unable to really move forward in any amiable fashion, and Trinidad, in the personality of its Prime Minister, Dr. Eric Williams, intervened in this process or engineered a moratorium as a means of reducing the tensions associated with this controversy. And the parties accepted a proposal from the UN Secretary General for his role as a good officer, which is in a sense what the agreement, the Geneva Agreement, had intended. And the Geneva Agreement is very clear. I don't really want to go through it now, but there is Article 4.2, which pertains to the role of the Secretary General. It is unambiguous. I would also refer to the UN Charter, Article 33.1, which I mentioned before, which said that they will seek a solution by negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, resort to regional agencies, or arrangements, or other peaceful means. You have there listed 9 different means. And I refer you to the term or, which in English means you have options. And I mentioned that because Venezuela has, in complaining and in trying to attack Guyana's stance as regards this Geneva Agreement, almost incomprehensibly to most of us, insists, and it has insisted in reaction to the decision taken by the Secretary General, to which I will refer later, insisted that the Geneva Agreement required that all of the 9 means mentioned would be explored in turn. Now, if you have already had a negotiation or you've already had arbitration, why would you think it appropriate to turn to one of these other methods? So this is really one of the areas over which the parties agreed and which contributes to the confusion that we have today. So you had the mixed commission, 4 years exhausted. Then you had the moratorium. The Secretary General could not find until 1990 a means acceptable to the 2 parties to move forward. I want that to be emphasized because in the context of a president calling for bilateral negotiations or military force, if one party refused to accede to that demand, you have to remember that this is something, the only sense in which many of the commentaries that you hear speaking about this is a dispute that has been going on for a long time. It is not true that it is a 100-year-old dispute. It was a dispute that was resolved in 1899. Okay, it was dug up in 1962, and there have been processes available to all UN members to try and resolve the matter. At the end of a process of good offices, which actually was not mentioned in Article 33 of the UN Charter, the Secretary General had resort to what is called good offices, where a number of prominent, as it turned out, Caribbean personalities, ending in Professor Norman Gervin, were appointed to facilitate the process in whatever means they could find that would be mutually acceptable to the parties. In 2015, and now remember this is a process running from 1990 to 2015, the 2 presidents were invited to a meeting by the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon of the United Nations, and he heard again Venezuela contending that the arbitration award of 1899 was null and void. They presented no evidence to support that. No justification was provided. And at the same time, Guyana is saying to the Secretary General that these means of settlement that it had experienced so far had led to an unsatisfactory outcome, including the loss of Ankoko Island to Venezuela. And therefore, Guyana called for a more definitive means to be agreed on or to be utilized in order to resolve this matter. President Maduro, on the other hand, insisted on the continuation of the good offices process. The SG observed during that meeting that it was a problem, one before us, eminently suited to resolution by the world's highest judicial body. And on November the 12th of 2015, that Secretary General presented what are called presented proposals that are called the way forward. Okay, and those proposals included a 12-month continuation of the good offices process, and that that would be a process that would now be perhaps a little more intense than had taken place before. And so he then moved to choose candidates who would facilitate that process. And out of the goodness of his heart, the president of Venezuela rejected 6 of the names of the persons named, and also required that he interview them before they're selected to carry out that process. Of course, this was not acceptable to anyone else. And the countries lost maybe about 18 months in trying to move that process forward. In the end, the secretaries general, because now you're having a transition, Ban Ki-moon and Secretary General Gutierrez, looking at the problem jointly to try to move the process forward, concluding that they would have one additional year. So Ban Ki-moon said, give it another year and have bilateral dialogue. That didn't happen. And jointly, the 2 secretaries general said, okay, notwithstanding what has happened, we suggest another year. And in that period, we will appoint someone. They appointed Doug Newlander, and Doug Newlander worked with the 2 countries. And that process that he oversaw ran from December 2016 to January 2018 and was concluded after receipt of a report from the UNSG. And was concluded after Doug Newlander reported to the new Secretary General regarding the outcome of the discussions. And I'll remind you that the SG had written to the 2 presidents saying, look, no, let me quote. If by the end of 2017, the Secretary General concludes that significant progress has not been made towards arriving at a full agreement for the solution of the controversy, he will choose the International Court of Justice as the next means of settlement, unless your government and the government of Venezuela jointly request that he refrain from doing so. What I read you there in that sentence was a sentence written by the SG to the 2 presidents. The one I'm actually reading from was the letter that was sent to President David Granger. And President Granger's letter was received by President Granger, and between the 2 presidents, Maduro and Granger, no joint letter was prepared and sent to the Secretary General. So when we hear from Venezuela that Venezuela never agreed to the ICJ, that assertion flies in the light of their signature on the Geneva Agreement. It also flies in the face of the enhanced mediation process, which was triggered by the 2 secretaries general and worked on by Ambassador Doug Newlander. And the call for bilateral talks pretends or seeks to suggest that in all the years since 1962 or 1966, no such or no bilateral discussions are taking place. These are all completely untrue. So after the exercise, Doug Newlander's report to the SG led to the SG concluding that this matter now, given all that had happened prior, should now be referred to the International Court of Justice. Let me say that the people and the government of Guyana welcomed that decision of the UNSG. It was a historic moment for Guyana. And on March 29th of 2018, as the agent for Guyana's agent to the ICJ, I actually signed documents instituting proceedings against the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela with respect to this matter. And in our application, we asked that the court look at the 1899 arbitral award and give its views on that award and the 1905 agreement as to whether Guyana enjoyed sovereignty over the territory between the Essequibo River and Venezuela, and also whether Venezuela enjoys full sovereignty over the territory west of the boundary, and whether Venezuela and Guyana were obliged to respect each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity and so forth as a result of the agreement that they had signed in 1899. In other words, the court is being asked to determine whether the 1899 arbitral award still stands and whether the two parties are bound by the commitments in those awards and the commitments that they had embraced in 1897, which underpinned the 1899 award. So that is the exercise there at the court. And I apologize for not calling the slides, but and now it's slide 14. Which I apologize.
I got so kind of wrapped up in the discussion that I forgot. I'm listening intently to the. I forgot I was supposed to be moving the slides.
Well, I also. So it's all right. We can forgive you. The problem is only mine. So at slide 14, what I tried to do here, because most people don't understand two things. One, why is it that you're at the ICJ? Two, why is the ICJ taking so long? And three, how is it that they hear the ICJ has looked at a particular matter that the lawyers have put to the ICJ? It has given a decision, and yet the case still seems to be going on. Every day people ask you, when is the court going to give a final decision? If you don't understand the process, then you are going to be frustrated like most of those that ask the questions. And so I invite listeners to recognize that you institute proceedings, so you've had institution of proceedings, but before the court can actually act, it has to determine whether it has jurisdiction. Once two parties don't agree, it has to decide whether it has jurisdiction. And in this case, of course, the two parties didn't agree. Venezuela has been arguing that it never agreed to the ICJ being the court to look at the matters before us. And the court, therefore, had first of all to turn to what is called this jurisdiction phase, okay, before anything else. So jurisdiction phase, and you have hearings by one, in response to memoranda submitted by the two parties, the court then decides on whether it has jurisdiction or not. The government of Guyana submitted its own documentation on jurisdiction. Venezuela never properly responded to the question of jurisdiction, and the court in November of 2022 gave its view on jurisdiction. After that jurisdiction phase, there is to be a merits phase, which is the current phase we're in, and it begins with a hearing on Guyana's memorial. This is what the court requires. However, on the day before the deadline for any objections from Venezuela, Venezuela submitted objections to the memorial. And there was a discussion of their preliminary objection, and that has in effect suspended the examination of merits, which is what should happen after the jurisdiction phase. And there has since been another, if you like, procedural hurdle, and that has arisen as a result of Guyana's objection. Guyana's call for the court to issue provisional measures. That was done as recently as the 14th and 15th of November, and both Guyana and Venezuela have responded to that complaint, as it were, if I might be allowed to use layman's language. We now await a decision by the court. Okay? If those are the only preliminary or procedural matters that arise, then one would expect the hearing to be reconvened, okay, after the court has decided on the provisional measures, and then Venezuela will have to submit by, as of now, the deadline they were given has been revised by 1 year, so they got themselves an extra year as a result of the preliminary objections. And as you will see, under the merits phase, they can rebut Guyana's memorial, and then Guyana will have the opportunity to respond to that rebuttal. So you're looking at a process that will take you probably no sooner than the end of 2024, assuming that Venezuela makes its submission. They have to respond to questions that the judges may pose after Guyana's response, and then I don't know, 6 months, 9 months or more for the court to make its decision. So it is a process that is long, and it is a process that can be affected by the circumstances pleaded by either the parties. And we've seen elsewhere, parties to the court have found a few days before the court hearings that they fire their entire team and therefore ask for the period they were given for preparation to be extended. And the court has really to be aware of these ruses, because they are not rare, and they sometimes underlie a failure to put together an acceptable or defensible case. So, as regards the question of jurisdiction, that was a process I tried to talk about. As regards the process of the question of jurisdiction, the court in 2018, June 2018, decided that it had jurisdiction, and the consequences of that, if it's examining the case, then it can pronounce on whether or not the boundaries continue. And it said, however, that it did not have jurisdiction to entertain Guyana's claims as regards events that took place after the signing of the Geneva Agreement in 1966. In a sense, that is a win for Venezuela, with which Guyana clearly is not going to be very happy, but that's the court's decision, and we have lived with it. Venezuela, on the other hand, had resorted to all sorts of attacks on the court. The preliminary objections, which was the first of the procedural issues, we are now on to slide 16, were lodged in June 22, as I mentioned, within the deadline, and the court responded to those preliminary issues by rejecting Venezuela's objection. First of all, that it didn't have the means to adjudicate. It wasn't authorized to adjudicate, or because the one party did agree. So that first preliminary set of objections has been dealt with. There were provisional measures, as I mentioned to you earlier late last month. And those provisional measures now, the request by Guyana for provisional measures, arise as a result of the announcement of a referendum by Venezuela. The procedural issues are on slide 16, and the provisional measures are arising from a consultative referendum which Guyana has argued is really a device to undercut or bypass the decision of the court, and that it has questions, as you can see on slide 17, which invite the public to express a view regarding 5 questions. And the campaign that is being run in Venezuela is a campaign that invites the public to answer yes 5 times. And those questions cause concern in Guyana. It is true, of course, that a country has the right to have whatever referendum it wants once it's consistent with their own constitution. The problem here is that Guyana's territory and Guyana's people and the safety of the territory and safety of the people are under threat from those decisions made by the decisions that may be used by the government of Venezuela to justify what in effect seems to be an annexation of Guyana or the bulk of Guyana's territory. And so Guyana has called on Venezuela or the court to have Venezuela desist from a number of steps or from a number of things. I don't want to go through them now, but basically to, if I might put it as generally as I can in non-legal terms, to invite Venezuela to refrain from taking any steps that will change the legal and constitutional status of Guyanese, that is, the people in Essequibo, and that would have any seek to effect any changes to the borders and boundaries. And that is the story behind what we're looking at. The other point I would want to make is that there is still considerable disagreement between the parties over a number of elements. There is disagreement over procedure, there is disagreement over substance, but the disagreement over substance now is substantial, and I see that something has caused the time to be dissipated.
No,
So
the time that we've been going. I suppose if you started 1899, it's hard to get from 1899 to 2024 in 20 minutes.
Yes.
So it's okay. I mean, we're perfectly fine, and I think that I think this is a good place for us to, in a sense, kind of bring Riyad in here, because I think as I read this, I have lots of questions, but my first question is, we should all be thinking about how to prevent this from happening, and it seems to me that the prevention would occur at some diplomatic place. And so perhaps, Riyad, if you can shed some light around sort of the sort of diplomatic maneuvers that should accompany this legal strategy that aims to have Venezuela desist from offering this referendum that would grant citizenship and a Venezuelan ID card to Guyanese resident in Essequibo.
Thanks, Terrence, and thanks for the invitation to be on this webinar. Good evening, everyone, and thanks to Carl for setting the scene for this discussion. Look, as a small state, Guyana has no option but to place its faith in international law and diplomacy. But barring, I'm not sure that whatever the ICJ says about the precautionary measures that Guyana is seeking regarding the Venezuelan referendum is going to have any effect on Mr. Maduro and his regime. I think the referendum is going to happen, and no amount of diplomacy can stop it. The question is, what can Guyana do to counter what might be the measures that Venezuela would take after passing this bogus referendum. I think so far the official response by the government of Guyana, led by the President Ali himself, has been quite correct. The president's statements and those emanating from the foreign ministry have been measured in tone, but strong in their refutal of Venezuela's fantastical and hostile narrative. That supporting statements have been made by CARICOM, the OAS Secretary General, the Commonwealth Secretary General, the US government, among others, speaks to diplomatic efforts by the government of Guyana. Surprisingly, I haven't seen a statement by the UK, but I may be wrong, and I stand to be corrected on that. One expects that the president and the foreign ministry, supported by our ambassadors to the UN and to the US and the OAS in particular, are working the phones and all lines of communication to keep our friends on side, to strengthen our strategic alliances, to educate those who might be misinformed for whatever reason, and to try to neutralize those who side with Venezuela. And make no mistake, Venezuela does have friends. They're not isolated. The bulk of international opinion might be against them, but they are not isolated. They have very powerful friends. And we always have to be aware of that, and we have to be looking for our own friends. I think that the virtual meeting between President Ali and President Lula of Brazil was a good example of the type of high-level diplomacy that the president is pursuing, that the government of Guyana is pursuing. And there's probably a lot more of that going on, but not everything is going to be placed in the public domain. For diplomacy to be effective, there has to be space for quiet diplomacy. And it is the quiet diplomacy that perhaps can help to strengthen support for our position without broadcasting to our neighbors to the west exactly what we're doing, even as they crank up the volume and engage in megaphone diplomacy, which frankly is an oxymoron. Guyana's position, as Carl has pointed, has been based on the fundamental principles, the fundamental principle of respect for international law, and respect for the 1899 arbitral award and the terms of the Geneva Agreement. This position and the facts have to be reinforced continuously and robustly at every opportunity and in every forum to counter Venezuelan misinformation and propaganda. I expect that our diplomats are working overtime to do just that, even as our own outstanding team of international lawyers is pursuing the case at the ICJ. Diplomacy and the legal efforts have to complement each other. I've got a few more points, but in the interest of time and to give our colleagues a chance to chip in, and to have more of an interactive discussion, let me stop there, and and I'm happy to come back in.
Okay, so I'll look back, but I wanted to, as you were speaking, the sort of question came in was the following, and I thought it would be something that aligned with, in a sense. I mean, Professor Griffith, there's a whole lot at stake here. I mean, as I read this, as I read this consultative referendum, it's clear this is something that strikes at the heart of Guyana, and perhaps we're not. I mean, we're doing some. Are we doing enough? And some folks who are listening are thinking, perhaps we're not doing, it's still too small. It's still too inside baseball. There's not some broad, massive countrywide education around, what's at stake. Give us a thought of how this fits in. What's at stake around our aspirations, around our recent discovery of oil. How do we think of it all together?
Thank you, Terrence. Let me join the other colleagues in thanking you for the invitation and applauding Carl for his wonderful initial presentation. In terms of what's at stake, I want to go back to something that Carl mentioned, and that is an indication that the extent of Venezuela's claim to the Essequibo represents 74% of Guyana's territory. I think it's useful sometimes to do a drill down to better appreciate what that 74% represents, what's at stake in that 74% of our national patrimony. The 74% is 61,600 square miles. The 74% represents 6 of Guyana's 10 regions. Talking about Region 1 and Region 2. You're talking about parts of Regions 3 and 7 and 8 and 9. If you were to do a comparison of geographic reference points of what does this Essequibo compare to elsewhere, to other nations, you might be surprised to learn that Jamaica can fit into the Essequibo 14 and a half times. You're talking about that amount of territory. You might be surprised that Belgium can fit into the Essequibo 4 times. But Terrence, you might also be surprised that Israel, the state of Israel, can fit into that Essequibo about 8 times. So we're not talking about a minuscule piece of land that is at stake. We're talking about a significant amount of our national patrimony. But we know, for example, we know for a fact as well, that this is not land unpeopled. Yes, it's sparsely populated, but there are people and resources in that 74% of our native land. And I know you're wondering, some colleagues viewing the show are wondering, well, who are these people in this Essequibo? Tell you what those people represent. We're talking about 300,000 of the country's 800,000 in that Essequibo. We're talking about our first peoples, our native Guyanese. 9 sets of them exist in the nation. Most of our first peoples are in Essequibo. We're talking about Wai, Makushi, Patamona, Lokona, Carib, Warao, Wapishana, Pemon, Akawayo. Guyana's peoples are in that Essequibo. But part of the anxiety, part of the greed of the Venezuelans in regards to that 74% is not simply because there are people there, it's because of the resources there. What resources, you may ask? Rich agricultural lands in that Essequibo. Now, we know that Guyana's oil and gas in the last 5-7 years since 2015 discovery are offshore, but there is oil on those dear lands. Many of us recall the conversations back in the 70s about the Takatu Basin. It's not only offshore resources in the oil and gas domain that exists, but oil and gas onshore. Bauxite is in that Essequibo. Gold is in that Essequibo. Manganese. Uranium is in that Essequibo. So we're talking about significant natural resources. We're talking about part of the Guyana Shield representing the significant biodiversity in that Essequibo. And so I think it's important to not only mention the 74%, but to have an appreciation of the stakes are significant, the stakes are high. Not a minuscule piece of land, not one or two people, not just mud flats, gold, manganese, bauxite, precious metals, all in that Essequibo. So we're talking about significant stakes. The stakes are high. I'll pause there.
Yeah, so, I want to bring Professor Anthony Bryan in at this moment. The stakes are high. We're talking of, 300,000 over 800,000 people. We're talking of 9 sets of the first people. So I just had the thought that 300,000 people would what percentage of the CARICOM community would that constitute? I'm assuming that, that's not an insignificant percentage of the CARICOM community. And so the question that I, in a sense, wanted you to weigh in on was to give a kind of regional perspective on what's happening here. We saw just today in the newspaper editorial in the Stabroek News asking the question about, where are our neighbors? We saw also recently, just today actually, someone sent talking about some commercial activity that is being finally consummated between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela. And so the question is, give us a sense of how the regional interests can better align with Guyana's interests in this context.
Thank you very much, Terrence. I hope you're hearing me. I have to
We can hear you
use
fine.
my phone. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Went off.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me pay a tribute to Carl. I listened to him yesterday when he was at the Cipriani Labour College in Trinidad, and I listened to him today. And I think that we are all enlightened as to the solid nature of Guyana's case. As far as the CARICOM region is concerned, it is solidly behind Guyana. There are tremendous examples of relationships between Guyana and sister CARICOM countries. Very pronounced, I think, in Barbados, Antigua, Trinidad and Tobago. Visits of respective heads of government to Guyana and the expression of support. So I think that one can simply conclude that CARICOM is solidly behind Guyana's claim and certainly the pursuit that they have made to the ICJ. Having said that, wonder whether there is more that can be done. And I think that Riyad put it quite well. And maybe there has to be some more vocal support, some more, as it were, up to the minute support, demonstrations of support. I understand reading today in the papers that Ralph Gonsalves, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent the Grenadines, is going to Venezuela. He says he's just going to Venezuela, but actually he's going to try to talk to Maduro to try to dissuade him from the saber rattling that's going on. And I use that term advisedly, There is saber rattling. Every Venezuelan president in one form or another has used the Guyana-Venezuela controversy for political gain. And I think in the case of Maduro, it's pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious. This question of Essequibo didn't raise its head until there was a substantial amount of oil coming from Guyana. Okay? As Ivelaw has pointed out, it's not only a question of oil. It's agricultural land. It's gold. Maybe it's lithium. We don't know. But it's territory that belongs to Guyana. It has never belonged to Venezuela. And the point is that when Maduro does this, he is doing it for a purpose. He's whipping up nationalism, enhancing his electoral prospects. He is certainly trying to unite the country, even the anti-Chavista people, and sort of hoping that this would have a rally around the flag effect in Venezuela. That's how I see it. I see it as saber rattling, but I think David Lewis pointed out initially that saber rattling could actually become a grab for territory. It's happened in other parts of Latin America. And why does one assume it couldn't happen in Venezuela? But as far as I'm concerned, there is full CARICOM support, even from my country of Trinidad and Tobago. The Prime Minister has stated it ad nauseum. We are in support of Venezuela's claim. I think, behind the scenes.
You didn't
That's a slip of the tongue, Tony. A slip of the tongue.
Yeah, that was you said you didn't mean to say we're in support of Venezuela's claim, did you?
Oh, sorry. All right. No, I didn't mean to say that. And excuse me if I had a senior moment there. Yes, but Carl raised an interesting point. A country like Trinidad that has dealings with Venezuela over oil, how does it, in other words, walk that very fine line between diplomatic neutrality and, seeing to one's interest? I could go back as an historian and tell you that throughout my studies of history, I have understood all along that countries don't necessarily have friends. They have interests. And so Trinidad has an interest with Venezuela. But that doesn't mean that it is in support of Venezuela's position. No, this has been stated very clearly time and time again. So I hope that let me put it this way, I hope that it is saber rattling and nothing more. That's what I hope. And, there is wide regional support and international support for Guyana's position. So, as Ivelaw has pointed out time and time again, were an invasion to take place, it would alter considerably the geopolitical map of South America. Venezuela, Brazil, a whole host of countries that have to. And don't think that Venezuela doesn't seize territory. They seized Andaco Island. Trinidad surrendered Patos at independence. They have drawn a maritime jurisdiction that seems to take in most of the Caribbean Sea and half of the South Atlantic. So it's not beyond the possibility that this thing could really blow up into a regional war, the sort that we have never seen, certainly since the time of Peru and Chile. Well, that's about all I have to offer. Thank you.
No, Terrence, I want to offer. Can I offer a footnote to something that Tony said? I agree with you entirely, Tony, that, and it's one of the hallmarks of international politics, as we know, that states put their interests above friendship. And it's for that very reason that I think there is some understandable nervousness about some CARICOM member states seem to be dithering as to whether or not they should vocally endorse Guyana, as has been the case before. And I think if you take a look at the evidence of the last 3-4 years, as Maduro tries to reestablish Petrocaribe, he is dangling the Petrocaribe possibility of reestablishment which would suit the national interests of several Caribbean member states as a way of rupturing, withering down, fracturing the solidarity. In April of this year, Prime Minister St. Vincent went. In September of this year, Prime Minister Barbados went, Caracas. A couple of weeks ago, Prime Minister of St. Lucia went. So, and each of these countries have their interests. And part of their interest has to do with how can they enhance their greatest survivability given the oil circumstance. But I want to mention one other thing in regard to the Caribbean. President Maduro made a significant tweet on September 28th. He announced that Venezuela was launching a diplomatic campaign in the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
He is making sure that each Caribbean country hears his case. So I think we used to assume that all Caribbean countries would be solid behind Guyana. Don't forget, as Tony quite rightly said, countries have national interests. And sometimes in the context of how do they manage those national interests, there is reason to worry about the absence of a solid. Yes, CARICOM Secretary put out a statement, sounds nice, but individual countries can do their own things.
Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right, Ivelaw. Oh, sorry. No, I'm saying Ivelaw is correct in the sense that there is some concern, some nervousness, as you would say. The one thing I wanted to mention, actually, and you raised it with respect to Petrocaribe, Chavez dangled that during his regime. That is why you had a pilgrimage to Caracas from the states in the region. Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados rejected that. They didn't do any of that. So I am of the opinion that you can no longer base a regional energy security on, as it were, Venezuelan largesse. That would be a big mistake to do that again. This time you should really base that regional energy security on the backs of Suriname, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago. That is what has to happen, not Venezuela, please.
Yeah, Tony.
Terrence, just let me add to Ivelaw and Tony's points. That last one in particular about anchoring energy security for CARICOM and the Southern Caribbean, Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago is one that we've talked about again and again. But until we can find a mechanism to make that happen, of course, some of our CARICOM sister states will be looking for other solutions. Now, I just want to say that I find any suggestion that Guyana should be looking for peaceful dialogue unhelpful. I say look to the source of the current tensions. Guyana has not been the aggressor. Guyana has not been the agent provocateur. Guyana is simply doing what, after the exhaustion of decades of diplomatic dialogue, led us to do, and that is to go to the International Court, which is the only pathway to resolving the controversy. And to those who talk about negotiation, there is no room for negotiation. Maduro and Delcy Rodriguez as vice president have crossed a line in terms of the possibility of seeking respectful engagement. They have abused and attacked the government of Guyana and the president of Guyana in rather unstatesmanlike terms. They're not people who are showing themselves to be reasonable. We have to pursue our diplomacy with those closest to us and with others further away. We've got to cast our diplomatic net far and wide, and we've got to keep building our alliances, because even after December the 3rd, whatever happens at the ICJ in the next couple of years, we are dealing with an unstable neighbor to the west, and and a government that follows its own line of reasoning that is not in consonance with what we consider to be reasonable, what we consider to be right, and what we consider to be in accordance with international law and the conduct of international affairs. And I leave you with one last point. One does not appease a bully.
Absolutely.
No, I strongly agree with your sentiment, Riyad, and so it's for this reason that I am somewhat as a not a neutral, but as a quote, a man in the street on this. I think to myself, the CARICOM Secretariat sits in Guyana. Venezuela is engaged in a full court press, a full court diplomatic press on the folks who constitute CARICOM. It seems to me that there should not even be a shred of doubt about where the body whose secretariat sits in Georgetown, where that leads, and somehow I wanted to ask you if I have that wrong, or if there should even be a question of some nervousness in this regard.
Who are you asking?
I was asking you, so I wanted you to respond to that.
Well, the CARICOM Secretariat really is part of the Caribbean community. It's an organ of the Caribbean community. It's up to CARICOM's heads of government, the Conference of Heads of Government, and its foreign ministers to be making statements that are not just the usual statements that come out at meetings of heads and foreign ministers about support for Guyana's sovereignty and territorial integrity and the process at the International Court of Justice. They have to be seen to be working with those who think they're friends with Maduro. They should be using their own good offices to get him to desist from his attitude. And our own diplomacy should be aimed at working with those friends of ours who have the ability to engage with Maduro. But the positioning of the CARICOM Secretariat in Guyana is helpful to a certain extent, but it goes beyond just the location of the Secretariat and the work of the Secretariat. This is something that has to be pursued at the highest political levels within CARICOM.
So one other question which has popped in, and I'm just sort of paraphrasing it. The question is for everyone: what does a Guyanese do in support of the government and people and the territorial integrity of Guyana at this moment? I mean, if you were to say to me, someone in Festival City in North Rhineville, what should you do? How can you help the effort in this regard? Anyone? Yeah. What does a Guyanese? What can the Guyanese citizen do in order to?
I'm going to make one last point because I feel as if I've been talking to each other, others are not talking about. National unity is not an issue. The opposition and the government are on the same page. The people, if you look at social media, if you read the newspapers, Guyanese believe fervently in that Essequibo is ours. Essequibo is we own, as we say. But there has to be more that is done beyond just this sort of public sense of nationalism and patriotism, and it has to be continuous and consistent. It just can't be something when a flare-up happens that we all start showing maps of Guyana as it is and as we know it to be and do our thing. I go back to something I'd written about before. When Chile and Peru went to the International Court of Justice over a maritime dispute, and the ICJ settled the case in 2014, mostly in Chile's favor. leading up to that, Chile had established something like a national commission of experts drawn from both sides of the political divide and from civil society, academia, independent people, to help shape the national narrative and to underpin the efforts of its government, its diplomats, and its lawyers. And in presenting its case to the international community, whilst our case will similarly be fought at the ICJ, there has to be, I think, a broader attempt to back up the legal aspects of the case with wider public diplomacy that starts within our borders but goes out beyond.
No,
Terrence.
I think I see that need
Terrence.
for political education. Yes, David, I'm coming to you right now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I was looking at the time and seeing it all slip away. So I wanted you to sort of do a bit of summing up and then allow for everyone else to offer 2 minutes or so as a sort of final remark. It's amazing.
Yeah, well, I won't sum up because that's an insult to the panel and to our audience. I don't think anybody needs a summing up, but no, I think latching on to Riyad's point and what Chile did almost a decade ago, I think that it's critical, and people have mentioned it. Yes, you know, we've got a great team with the ICJ. That's the mechanism for a small country. It's looking good and so on. But at the end of the day, if we do not really understand the nature of the animal that we're dealing with, it won't matter, because, you know, I know the Venezuelans very well. I know that whole line of thought. I've lived in those countries under that. ICJ supports Guyana. So what? What are they going to make me do? Okay? These people won't even go on a plane into little Nicaragua to sit down with a brutal dictator and say, boy, you can't be doing that stuff. There, he took over the OAS office. He took over an OAS office, a diplomatic compound, paid no money, did nothing. So what? Troops in your face. And that's little Nicaragua. I just see Venezuela doing what they've been doing for years, whatever they want to do. And who is going to come and stop me? Some legal resolution in The Hague? Some team of lawyers saying that my legal case was useless? So they're going to do the December 3rd referendum. And then they're going to give ID cards and everything to everybody saying, you are now Venezuelan. And we're going to continue? What else are we going to, because behind the scenes, we're winning. We're doing a good job. We've got the messaging right. In the real world, that doesn't add up to anything. I'll give you $5 and buy a coffee at Starbucks and talk it over. So I think yes, we continue that. That's our track. CARICOM, we work with them because we know the whole thing of neutrality. But in the meantime, we need to have a plan B. And plan B needs to start working. Otherwise, and I think the question, and for the diplomats in the room, not think that David Lewis thinks we're going to go to war with Venezuela and different. No, my question is our deterrent plan in place? I see no deterrence. And if we think the United States is going to do anything, when over the past 6 months, all they've done is jump into bed with Maduro to get a hand of that gas, and they've given a green light to my wonderful fellow nationals in Trinidad who are signing the deal. And as we say in Washington, follow the money and you know what's going to happen. I mean, who are we left with? And Ralph is going to go to Caracas and do exactly what he did when he went to Nicaragua. And you know what happened when he left Nicaragua? Ortega arrested the Afro-Nicaraguan leaders and the Mosquito leaders who had just given Ralph an honorary degree at their university. So, you know, Ralph was my professor at
I don't want
UWI.
Ralph to sue me to,
No, well, no, he was my professor at UWI, and I won't even say that the bad things in my brain were because of him. No, he gave me a lot of good stuff. But please, let's not think that anything serious is going on there. That's just platitudes. Those are just tactics that dilatory and waste our time, and meanwhile we continue. So again, my question is, where is our deterrence, and are we working on that as plan B? While we continue with plan A, but there are going to be a series of actions that Venezuela takes, regardless of what wins we have at the ICJ. And we need to plan for those actions because they are going to happen, because every message and every action we've seen from Venezuela up to now is precisely that. You know what? I can do whatever I want, and I don't care what you do. And you're going to have to do way more than what you're doing right now to stop me from that, because this is, as one of you mentioned, this is a big deal, not just for Guyana. This is a big deal for Venezuela. One last anecdote. We were just in London at an event on Guyana, and a Guyanese businessman sat down at lunch with me and a couple of people, and he was so, well, you know, I'm sure Exxon is already getting the right message to Washington, and of course now we have Chevron, and so, and I said, you mean you think that Exxon and Chevron are going to do anything, especially if none of their oil territory is touched? Last thing I checked, there ain't no Exxon in Essequibo, you know? So I'm not thinking, you know, if we're thinking that they're going to go and do something for us when ain't nobody touching their oil, I mean, you guys are seriously mistaken. And he kind of choked on his curry chicken and then said, well, let's see what happens, you know? So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you, guys.
Well,
Can I add a note?
Yes, so perhaps we have to go to you, Carl, to, you know, where is our deterrent?
Well, I don't have a perfect answer, but what I would like to, first of all, is to endorse the concerns that I've heard voiced about the absence of a vibrant, if you like, a militant PR in respect to this threat posed to Guyana. And it is true, as Riyad has observed, that you have to use all the platforms at your disposal. The diplomatic and the legal have been triggered. I'm not sure that enough has been done on the diplomatic side, but most certainly the work will have to be done also on the military side and on the side of the diaspora, using the diaspora wherever they are, whether it is in the US, Canada, wherever else. That has to be done. Civil society has to be worked on. And there's a dimension which has worried me. I've been attacked for pointing this out. The debate in Guyana over the petroleum operations has become tied up, that is over the agreement, has become tied up with advocates who are really on the zero conservation platform, that is no exploitation of oil. And that tremendous attack that has been visible in Guyana since 2018, 2019 has not helped. I believe it has contributed to the spunk that we see exhibited by our neighbor. I know not everybody is going to agree on that, but most certainly you have to understand that if you're faced by a threat of the kind that is existential, you have to do your best to ensure that internal unity is at a maximum level. And internal unity is not only about one political party versus another political party, it is also about civil society, where it believes it has a voice, whether you're doing things that they don't like, how best do you attenuate the sort of nervousness they have, because they can be disruptive and problematic. So I think that's a dimension that we don't pay enough attention to. And the points being made about the dependence and the assumption that the US is going to come to your aid, it is true that there is a fantastic belief in Guyana on this side, which is somewhat naive, You have to work with all of your allies as well as potential allies in order to get them to be talking, to be sending, serious messages and so forth. And you can't, at this point, afford, as we sometimes seem to do, to be engaging in quarrels with potential or actual allies. You have to be bearing in mind that as a small state, you have to have as many friends as you can, no enemies, practically no enemies, and that has to be worked on. So a lot of what I've heard arising from the concerns and nervousness of the panel, I think, is justified. And there is no simple silver bullet to this. One has to work on all fronts, and you have to work assiduously. It's going to cost money. You have to make better use of your skills, the resources that we have, many of which are lying outside of our borders. We have to find a way to mobilize them, if not to bring them within the borders, then to institutionally capture them, their skills and their influences. And we have been scandalously neglectful of those skills. That is my view.
Yeah, Professor Bryan, I'll bring you in here. Where is our deterrent? It seems to. Where is the regional deterrent?
You're muted, Tony.
You're muted. You're muted. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't have an answer to that, Terrence. It reminds me of Germany and the Vatican in World War II, when the Pope was trying to intercede with Hitler, and Hitler's response was, "Well, how many divisions does the Pope have?" I am just simply hoping that this is saber rattling. I come back to that. That's the only deterrent that I can see. In terms of preparing for the obvious, well, guys, all of you are Guyanese. You better become fluent in Spanish if that's if David's prediction is correct. So I don't really have an answer. Events have to play themselves out, but I'm going to hedge my bets a little bit and say that there is going to be no invasion of Guyanese territory. Okay, that's what I'll say.
Certainly,
but there will be a referendum.
Yes.
There will be a referendum.
And that referendum, the vote is yes to that.
And our girl may end up being a little bit pregnant, correct? And once she's a little bit pregnant, we're there already. There's no turning back. That's my concern. You see, this is slippery slopes, and deterrence functions because you realize, we're not going to war. We're looking to deter war, but if we continue to allow the small steps that inch in favor of the enemy and not in our favor, then by all other means, you're at war without war. And that's the problem. And the Venezuelans have been very smart that they're not talking about taking terror. No, they're talking, we've got some people there and we believe they're our people. Let's let the people speak. I mean, they've even argued that this is a very democratic, participatory exercise. So they are following that same pathway that we want them to follow, which is diplomacy, discussion, and so on. But within it, they then go and take real life actions. And unless
except of course, the referendum is not being offered to Guyanese, the people of Essequibo. It is
right.
it is a unique case. I mean, Russia didn't ask the people outside of the Ukraine whether they should invade. In this case, you are asking the people outside of Essequibo whether you should invade, and the referendum says that. So that is a dimension we often forget.
Which is even worse, Carl.
It's not so clever. It's not so clever. That is very transparent.
Well, it makes it even worse because they're giving us the playbook, and they're saying, you know what, we can make this playbook win. You know, I mean, it's like the Super Bowl. You're playing against Tom Brady, and you know the guy's gonna beat you every time. And each time you go back to the same, we're gonna do the same stuff, and he comes back and still beats you. The Venezuelans are not stupid on this, and they're looking around and they say, oh, who's gonna do something? Lula in Brazil. So now, really, one very specific, Carl, because you work with the government. I think the government in Georgetown needs to put aside the proprieties of current political protocol, and they need to get Javier Milei on their side and forget about the fact that to the US and to everybody else, this is going to be worse than little Trump, because you get that guy in Argentina on your side, and that's going to be a deterrent, because all he cares about is not Guyana. He cares about opposing somebody like Maduro. And right now, that's the kind of alliance Guyana needs. Not somebody who's playing footsie with Maduro, somebody who just says, no, you know, he just told everybody, you know what? Private citizens want to do business with China and with communist country under my government. Fine, that's your business. Now, one state entity in Argentina is going to be doing any business with China, with Cuba, with Nicaragua, with Venezuela, with Iran, with none of those people. That's what he said. So let's take advantage of that. But if we keep on the footsie of ex-presidents and all this kind, I mean, I'm just concerned that that's not going to lead us to any success anywhere, because none of those actions can give us the deterrence that Maduro will listen to.
Gentlemen, I've got to go catch my plane in a few minutes, but let me just make two quick observations.
I was going to come to you and say, who do you think Maduro listens to? So put that into your.
Well, I'll answer that question when I get back to New York. But let me raise another issue right now. I simply want to restate something I advocated beginning 3 years ago. There are some imperatives as we manage this enterprise. Carl mentioned some of them. Riyad mentioned some of them. There's a public education imperative. And not only the public education in Georgetown, not only the public education in English. We've got 9 indigenous people, many of whom struggle with English. You know, I had a wonderful opportunity when I was in Guyana, in Lethem, to hear the Guyanese national anthem sung in Wapichana. People understand the indigenous language better than English. The imperative for public education is there. Now, there's an imperative, and I think it was Riyad who mentioned it, there's an imperative to continue enhancing our physical military assets. Yes, we're not going to be able to match Maduro, but you've got to create some psychological adjustment within the Guyanese populace, that at least you are managing to keep the psychological warfare that Maduro is playing at bay. Enhancing your security assets is critical. And I'm delighted that we are pushing the envelope on the defense diplomacy imperative. But let me end on this note in regard to the diplomacy. I think we've got to be coming back to what David said. Guyana's government has to be a little more aggressive. Maduro wants to get into BRICS. What are we talking? How are we talking to the people who will make that decision for him? Are we enabling them to see the threat that he presents to a potential superpower in the petro world? I don't know that, to put things that David mentioned, playing niceties. This is not a time for niceties. We've got to be aggressive. We've got to be bold. And as we all know, la lucha continua. Gentlemen, I've got to go.
Okay, safe travels. And if I don't see you, have a wonderful Thanksgiving. And
you as well. You as well, Riyad and Carl and David and Tony.
And that's a good point you closed on there. I think that is very true.
Gentlemen, I know I've taken tremendous liberties with your time. It's we've gone for 1 hour and 45, but we've actually had quite steadily on just one platform where we've had about 50 people who have continuously been observing on this kind of very narrow platform. So I suspect that it's been listened to in a number of in a number of places. So I'll take this opportunity here to kind of bring us to a close. And so perhaps I'll start with you, Tony, and then David and Riyad, and finally close with you, Carl. So we'll take 1 minute to the end, and you get the first of the last words, Tony.
No, it's been a very productive discussion. I think what I've seen are doses of reality. David pushes that quite well. I've seen the the historical explanations that Carl went into, which puts the Guyana claim on very firm ground. I believe that there is a demand for, maybe as Riyad suggested, a different kind of diplomacy, a far more aggressive kind of diplomacy, certainly emanating from Guyana itself. Again, I would put a cap on it by saying I am optimistic that this is a certain amount of saber rattling. But as David pointed out, I think quite rightly, if you have a series of people in the Essequibo who are granted Venezuelan IDs and so on, what does that do? Is that a fifth column for Guyanese for Venezuelan takeover in some form or fashion? You don't have to attack militarily; you just have to win some people over. That's the point.
Well, winning some people over, David. What do we need to do to win some people over?
Well, I think events like these, as I mentioned at the beginning, the government has very powerful lobbying firms here in Washington working for them. I, for one, and I keep my tabs on these things. This is my business. I don't know what they're doing for Guyana at this point. And these are things that can be done. You have think tanks, you have academic outfits, all of which, by the way, as we all know too well, their focus when people talk about Latin America and the Caribbean is Latin America. And while many of them may have programs which are anti-Maduro, they are pro-Venezuela programs, which is one of the reasons why not one of them has done anything on this issue, because it puts them between and betwixt. Well, we need to force them between and betwixt, because supposedly anybody working on Latin America and the Caribbean, your position is to stand against a violation of geographic, territorial agreements that have been established over centuries. That is one of the solemn pieces of unity at the OAS, as Riyad has mentioned. Well, let's push the envelope on those people. And in the business community, it's the same. I mean, great, okay, Exxon will do what Exxon needs to do for its stockholders, but Exxon is operating in Guyana. Chevron is now operating in Guyana. Guyana owns that. We need to then say, okay, guys, you need to, it's good to be making money, but here's something which is bigger. You need to show me some leg that you're with me. You're not this kind of neutral in the middle. Oh, it doesn't affect me, because this is going to affect everybody. And, we don't need you to stand up at the ICJ and do an amicus brief, but silence is not good. In business, the words we hate most from a client or a target client is no news. No news is never good news in business. We want some news, and silence is not good, because silence means something is happening that I am not involved with, and then I get a surprise. And that's the second thing we hate in business. We hate surprises in business, because the surprise is never that you won the Powerball. The surprise is that, oh, the check that was coming next month, something happened, it's not coming. So let's prepare for that. Let's not have surprises. And there's a lot we can do. And between GBJ and CPC, I think we're doing something. But we can rally. We can rally troops and get more involvement. So Thank you all again.
Thank you, David. You've just given them a really good thought that perhaps we should have an in-person GBJ CPC type event in Washington, D.C. to kind of rally some of the troops there in terms of the Guyana side of the ball. When we were growing up, they'd say silence is golden, but for David, silence precedes the surprise. So how do we David has the right mentality. There's a wonderful book written by an astronaut, and the name escapes me now, but the essential argument of the book is that you scan the environment every 15 minutes to see what threats are there. And so David has just given the thesis of this book, which is, we're constantly thinking what can go wrong and try to figure it out. So how do we manage these potential threats that David has left us to think about? Riyad, can you hear me? Are you still there?
Yeah. I didn't know you were turning to me with posing me that question from you. I thought it was more rhetorical than anything. One closing thought. Whilst we've been accustomed to saber rattling from Venezuela for years and years, this latest bit of saber rattling is nastier than it's ever been, and still very unpredictable in the consequences that might flow. We have no other option but to look at today, tomorrow, and the foreseeable future in terms of the uncertainties that could arise from the referendum. And in that regard, our national policy, our diplomacy will have to be proactive, consistent, and constant, if not enhanced. And as an afterthought, and I think might have been Ivelaw who touched on this, we should be looking not only on our not only looking to our traditional friends and allies, but to Venezuela's friends with whom we are also friendly in terms of our diplomatic outreach. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be part of this rather lively discussion.
Thank you, Riyad. I will finally at the end, I think I've earned, I haven't earned, but I will take the prerogative of saying, Carl, you get the last word.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Terrence. I would also like to thank you for staging this event, and to the fellow panelists for many useful ideas as well as observations. I would say that coming out of it, and I'm not going to attempt to summarize anything either, but coming out of it from where I sit, it seems that one of the areas that the government may wish to pay attention to is to use David's term to be more aggressive in our more aggressive and imaginative in the utilization of the instruments that are available to us, and also to try and see what we can do amongst ourselves, so that the question of costless action in defiance of international norms doesn't arise. And many of these were suggested, working on the BRICS, dealing with the corporations. Of course, the largest Chinese corporation in petroleum, CNOOC, is operating in Guyana. I don't know to what extent the government has approached them as separate from the government of separate from the Chinese government, but we have a lot to do, and it seems that the general view is that we haven't made as much of an impact in this arena on the public perception as we could, and David has specifically mentioned the question of lobbyists, which I am of the view that we could do a lot more on that front, given that lobbyists are being paid. So these are just some of the takeaways that have caught my attention in terms of the response. And there is no simple way to solve this problem, but in fact, there's a lot to be done between now and even between now and the end of the year. So let's see what can be done to persuade the government and the other bodies that are interested to do the necessary.
Well, on that note, I think we will hope that we've been listened to and look forward to future activity in terms of supporting Guyana and its case for the ICJ and its case in the world of public opinion. So, gentle folks, have a wonderful evening, and thank you once again. This is wonderful. Thanks.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
You're very late, Riyad, so
Good evening.
yes, you guys have a wonderful evening. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Right.
Bye.